Moving on from the Maya, seemed like there's more I should say about them. Again, they're still around. They still live near the big jungles. The next group, probably the Aztec. The Aztec was a group that was met by a leader named Cortez. He did not allow the human sacrifices to go on. He went in and started killing them in droves. Your book gives 4 reasons why the Indians lost. Reason number 1 was the fear factor. The Indians believed that Cortez was a god. They believed that the Europeans on horseback were 2-headed creatures with 4 legs and 2 heads. They did not, and also keep in mind the horse was armed with steel armor, and so was the Spaniards. Also, the Spaniards had steel for armor. They had steel helmets. They had guns. They had cannon. And then keep in mind too that half of Montezuma's army would not fight. But the real reason, Cortez's troops, such as they were, he recruited from the rebellious Indians who were rebelling against the Aztec rule. What were the Aztecs doing wrong? Aztecs tax collectors would go around and they take everything they wanted, including wives and children. They take the young girls to use as sex slaves. This led to the people of Mexico, who were not Aztec, rebelling against the Aztecs. Basically, folks, the Aztecs destroyed themselves. If Cortez would have found a group of people who said, oh, Montezuma is so great, he insists on justice, he keeps us at peace, he keeps law and order among us, he keeps down the outlaws, and everybody is treated fairly, Cortez would have had to get in his boat and go home, except for one day. When Cortez landed in Mexico, he told him, burn your ship. Just like Julius Caesar said, burn the bridges. And Cortez, he said, we're either going to conquer Mexico or we're going to die. And we're not going to leave. So, anyway, the Aztecs were conquered, mostly enslaved. There were attempts made to forcibly convert them to Christianity. All this is in the records. Now, down in South America, you have a group of people called the Incas. The Incas lived in what is today Peru, on the Pacific side of South America. The Spaniards had crossed the Isthmus of Panama and seen the ocean, and they called it Pacific, which means peaceful ocean, because, again, the Pacific Ocean can be much more tranquil than the Atlantic Ocean ever gets. I'm not sure why that is. Anyway, some Spaniards moved in and started a colony there in what is today Peru. Then they noticed that the people of the Incas started fighting among themselves. And the Spanish, this is their chance. They moved in while the Indians were fighting among themselves and conquered the Incas. Now, an Inca chieftain, the Inca chieftain said, I can fill this room half full of gold as high as I can reach. Now this chieftain was a tall man. The room was the size of a classroom. He said, I can fill it half full as high as I can reach with gold. He did. Pizarro killed him. It sounds treacherous, it was. Pizarro was later killed by one of his own men. The Spaniards wound up taking this gold back to Europe, and it finally alleviated the gold shortage that existed in Europe for more than 1,200 years. Now, this leads to the accusation, which has some foundation, that Europeans stole their wealth and built their might on the wealth of people they stole from. All right, go ahead and nod your head, but I want to ask somebody, from whom did Europeans steal the airplane? From whom did Europeans steal the automobile? From whom did Europeans steal the incandescent light? By stealing, I mean, suppose there had been a group who had automobiles, and Europeans sneaked in one day, took off the automobiles, then now only the Europeans have, this other group doesn't. That's my definition of stealing. No, Europeans did not steal the automobile. Europeans did not steal. Now, they stole gold. which alleviated. Now, again, folk, I had a young girl in the other class ask me, am I saying the end justifies the means? You can say what you want to. If the Indians had been allowed, left alone and allowed to stay here, would they have, and again, you might say, would they have developed airplanes? Would they have invented a light bulb? Would they have invented the electric motor? Would they have invented the computer? Would they have invented the radio with television? They were not even heading in that direction. It appears to me then, folk, from what I'm saying, is that a lot of what the Europeans did to the American Indians, I'm not going to say it's justifiable, it's just what humans do to each other when they can. And if you think it's wrong, you need to, this may sound harsh, you need to wake up to the world of reality. That's the way it actually is. I mean, yes, was I ever mistreated as a youngster? I finally stopped being mistreated when I started to realize the problem. Yes, I met the enemy finally. The enemy was me. I have met the enemy and it is me. And if you feel like you're being mistreated, taken advantage of, maybe you need to take a firm, hard look at yourself. All right, I'll stop. Anybody have any comments, questions? If you don't like what I said, I'm going to repeat. I don't like it either. But folk, I feel like I've got to teach you the way I see it, the way I believe it. And I am quite concerned about the issue, as you might can tell. Highly concerned. What could have been done? All right, I want to remind you of something. There was a man in Pennsylvania named William Penn. That's what Pennsylvania is named after. He decided we're going to treat the Indians right. So every bit of land that the white man used, he went to the Indians and negotiated and bought it, paid a price for it. Gave the Indians things like hatchets and maybe even some alcohol or whatever, and but hatchets and blankets and building materials, paid for the land, and he was really wise and just. The treaty lasted a generation or two. And then the Indians felt like they were being cheated, and they said they're white men, so they moved in and stole a bunch of white children and adopted them. The white militia moved in and defeated the Indians and drove them all the way out of Pennsylvania. The Indian talk, by the way, they're sometimes called the Lenape or the Delaware, two different names for the same group, Lenape Indians or Delaware. And there's been all kinds of stories. Some whites would not go back. They said they'd been so amalgamated among the Indians that they said, we're Indian now, we're not going back. But they were basically, the point I'm making is, you cannot indefinitely live at peace with people who don't have your ideas about property, about life, about values. Sooner or later, something's going to happen that will break the whole system down and lead to conflict. Just like as soon as World War II was over, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in what we call a Cold War. The two sides were too much different. I wish I could tell you something else, but folk, I can't. Now, to move on, leaving the civilizations, by the way, all of these practiced human sacrifice, which the Spaniards put a stop to. The Nazca lines. Now, the Nazca lines are lines that go for scores of miles, straight, super straight lines that are impossible for a primitive people to build. Now, they train you if you ever join the army. If you are lost, by all means, use a compass. Or if you don't have one, line yourself up with some object. Look at, even if you line yourself, because if you start walking, every human walks with one stride bigger than the other, and you're going to wind up back where you started from, even particularly after you've known yourself out. You cannot walk a straight line unless you are following a compass or following the sun or following some star, or unless you're lining yourself up with trees. You cannot walk a straight line. And for once, your authors, in the sheer lack of ability to explain, and I can't explain the Nazca lines either, they say, some people say that the operation of building lines was directed from a space, who had radio contact down on the ground and told the people where to put the lines. This is the only one and only time I've known your authors to say anything of the sort. And again, if you have a better explanation, you're welcome to it. Not only are there straight lines, but there are pictures of a big, big owl that's too big for anyone to have made unless the operation were directed from high up, or unless they knew something about art that we don't. Big owl, big other types of animals. If you're on the ground, you won't even notice the Nazca lines. All right, granted, that over here where the Nazca lines aren't, the ground is one color. Then there's an ever so slight discoloration where the Nazca lines are. The Nazca lines are hundreds of feet wide. You don't notice them until you get high up in an airplane, look down, then they become clearly visible. On the ground, you have to know where to look for it to even notice them. Nazca lines. Who built them? Why? The answer to that, we don't know who built them. We don't know why. But they show a lot of artwork, huge artwork, and lines that... Now, in the city of Cuzco, which is a Peruvian city, I don't know if that's spelled with an S or a C. Cuzco is located on the seacoast, the Pacific Ocean, except for one thing. It's 13,000 feet up. It's a part of the Pacific where there's no beach. It's just like there's the water here in the ocean, and all of a sudden the land rises straight up 13,000 feet. And there at the top of it is Cuzco. The city of Cuzco is built with rocks that are shaped like the interlocking pieces of a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle. No two rocks have the same shape. The rocks were obviously quarried down on the ocean level. Now, here's two questions. Number one, how do they get these heavy, super heavy rocks up 13,000 feet? We don't know. Now, number two, the human body can breathe at 13,000 feet, but you can't go from sea level to 13,000 feet all at once. You could take several days to do it. Because the human body you will asphyxiate. If you just suddenly jump up 13,000 feet, you will asphyxiate. Now, we do know that these South American Indians had balloons. I mean big balloons that could carry human bodies. You might say, well, weren't they on their way to developing an airplane? No. The only thing we know they ever used these balloons for was when a person died, they put their body in a casket, attach the casket to a balloon and launch the balloon, and the balloon would float out over the Pacific Ocean, somewhere would run out of hot air, run out of smoke, and drop down. That was their burial. That's what the balloons were used for. When I said, didn't they even think of flying with those things and using them for transportation? Apparently not. Among Western man, the balloon led to the development of the airplane. But among these people, but the problem is they did not use balloons to lift these heavy rocks because you can't build a balloon, or hardly build a balloon strong enough to lift a rock that heavy. Did they use cables? 13,000 foot cable. These cables would get almost break under their own weight. Now, speaking of cables, for a long time we toyed with the idea of putting a space station 24,000 miles up, which would be located at the same place, right above the same spot on Earth, and then attaching cables to drag capsules up to that level. But we found no material that we know of could spare the weight of 24,000 miles of cable. Nothing. The cable itself would not bear its own weight, much less the weight of cargo. So that idea has been abandoned. But they had planned, here's what we'll use and here's how we'll do it. Their attempts didn't work. There are limits to what you can do. So the idea of getting people into orbit by means of cable is for the time being out the window. That's not to say it will never be done, but for the time being it won't be. Now, the point I'm making for all this, folk, is it appears that mankind way back yonder was very highly advanced. And somewhere along the way they lost that advancement. And all it took was one generation failing to teach the next. Parents can't teach it to their grandchildren. It's got to go through each and every generation. And if one generation is skipped, almost everything is lost. Now, there might have been a big catastrophe, maybe a nuclear war, maybe a super earthquake, and maybe just a bunch of infighting among themselves. And then again, maybe they adopted communism, which they didn't realize the path they were taking was going to lead them to destruction. All right. Now, among the North American Indians now, leaving Latin America, to show you again why I think that even North American Indians were highly advanced, they built mounds. The nearest mounds I know of here is the ones at Chota, located near Cartersville. I won't write that down, but yes, folk, there are Indian mounds in Georgia. There are Indian mounds in Ohio. There's a rattlesnake that is several miles. It's not holding. It goes in a shape of a wave, like. The rattlesnake has been repaired. We did not recognize it as a rattlesnake until we flew over and saw, hey, it has a head on one side and rattlers on the other. And it's our obvious art because the waves, the coil pattern is it couldn't be natural. It's just too lined up to be natural. This is a big rattlesnake in Ohio. But the Chota Indian mounds located in Cartersville, there are several of them, about 5 or 6 of them. They were occupied around the time of Charlemagne, during what we call the Dark Ages in Europe. And the last time they were occupied was during what we call the Renaissance in Europe, around the 1100s and 1200s. Why were they abandoned? I think, okay, first of all, backing up, the Indian mounds were used for burial. But it took a large group of hundreds of people working together to build them. Maybe thousands of people working together. They were abandoned when the Indians could no longer keep together more than about 200 or 300 people who were related but tribally related. And at that point, they could not keep them maintained or keep them up. They were also used for defense. I mean, you get on top of them, you could shoot arrows down or drop sticks and rocks, particularly rocks, down on the enemy below. They were good for defense, but they got to where that the tribes became so small that the mounds became impractical. So they were abandoned after a certain amount of time as the Indians kept on declining and declining and declining. The Indians who lived in the eastern part of the United States were generally known as the woodland. Now that covers the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chippewa, and the Miami, and these various smaller tribes were lumped together into a group called the woodland. Now, out west in New Mexico, there were the Pueblo Indians. They lived on a cliffside. Now, the Pueblo Indians are interesting in it. They built their houses by chipping away at rocks on the cliff, side of a cliff. And they chipped away at rocks and formed houses from what was left of the chips. They dropped the chips below. Now, to get to a Pueblo village, you had to climb a ladder. So they would drill holes in the stone and put pegs, in other words, wooden pegs, in the holes. Now there was a catch-22. If you didn't know which pegs would support your weight, you better not try to climb. The idea was that the people living in the village knew where to put their weight on which peg, And the enemy didn't. So the enemy would get so far up and all of a sudden step on a peg that wouldn't hold his weight, and down he'd go crashing down to his death. These were the Pueblo. The Pueblo eventually had to abandon their area because of drought, climate change. The rains stopped coming, and they kept hoping the rains would come, and they kept finding they realized the rains aren't going to come. Now, I want to say this about the New Mexico Indians. They were one of the few Indians who managed to hold off the white man for a few centuries. The Spanish, when they died, they lost all their horses, and a horse is one animal that can be tamed as an adult. Don't try that with some animals. Don't try that with cats. It won't work. But with the horse, anyway, these horses got loose. The Indians became excellent horsemen. They would go and capture the horses the Spanish left behind. Then the Indians also captured the burros, or donkeys, that the Spanish left behind. They became excellent horsemen. The Indians started trading with the Spanish for guns, and they became excellent shots with a rifle. They learned how to use their guns. The real problem with the Indians, now again, I had a man tell me this morning that the real problem with the Indians was they didn't have guns. No, they eventually got the guns and learned how to use them. They eventually got the horses. Well, what was the problem the Indians had? They limited their population. They could take care of the Spanish. They could defeat them. They remained independent. Spain was overthrown by the Mexicans. The Mexicans tried to conquer them. No dice. The Indians defeated the Mexicans. But then came the Americans. And the Americans came in huge, huge numbers. Come from Independence, Missouri, came from eastern United States, went out, and the Indians could not stand up to the sheer numbers of Americans who came out. And the Indians were ultimately conquered. I want to say this, American Indian women did not have more than about 2 or 3 babies per woman at the most. In the meantime, at this time in our history, when the Europeans first came over, the average European woman was having 6, 8, 10, 12, and 14 children. Ben Franklin was number 16 out of 17 children. Yes, he had one younger sister. And he had an older brother named James who controlled him for a while. This is in the record. Well, and also Europeans kept getting more settlers coming in from across the ocean. So folk picked the winner. This is one time in world history where that the civilized defeated the uncivilized. One of the few times. And again, I think the problem, all right, now. Living in the Caribbean was a group of Indians called the Arawak. The Arawak are now extinct. But if you go to Jamaica, you'll run into the word Arawak. I've been to Jamaica 2 times. I had a brother who taught school in Jamaica for 2.5 years. That's how come I know as little as I do about the Arawak. 60% of the Indians living in the Caribbean carry Arawak DNA. This is straight out of your book. So they're extinct. I mean, nobody is an Arawak anymore, but they carry the Arawak DNA, so the Arawak did not die off. Your book makes an interesting comment that is true of all your uncivilized American Indians. Their women were considered equal to the men. And I'm going to leave that for each of you to make up your mind for yourself what you think about that. This is also true of the North American Indians. I've already mentioned that the women would only have. This is true of socialistic women, communistic women. They tend to think that we've got to limit our population. The world can't hold anymore. They do, and they wind up being conquered. And oftentimes having everything they had taken away from them and enslaved. The Arawak became extinct. Now, I'll repeat something I said about the Indians living in what is today the United States. They were on their way, folk, not to building a higher level of civilization. They were on their way fast to extinction. And as bad as the white man was for them, the white man might actually have saved them from extinction. They were on their way to being wiped out, due to their own lack of population and the wars they were fighting on themselves and the disease. All right, somewhere along the way, the disease of smallpox and typhus. Smallpox and typhus hit the North American Indians. Now, you all probably heard that Columbus came across the ocean, what he did, but it's now known that fishermen were coming across the ocean constantly for 300 or 400 years before Columbus. They probably brought typhus and smallpox from Europe that wiped out large segments of the Indian population. Again, this is now well known. The Europeans would come across the ocean fish. In fact, the Pope actually sent, well, the Vikings came. All right, the Vikings came across first before Columbus, and the Pope actually sent a bishop. And the bishop built a church which is still standing to this day there in what is today Newfoundland, Nova Scotia. I'll have more to say about the Vikings when it comes to chapters 12. All right, I'm out of time. Again, this class, not as lively as the other one. But again, your comments, your input is welcome. Hopefully you're not afraid of that camera on the side. Everybody have a good couple of days, and next Wednesday, this upcoming Wednesday, and the following Monday after that, we're going to be talking about a topic that might get some people riled up.